Hello, and welcome back to Neon Liberalism, a weekly podcast where we talk about the issues of the day and try to put them in a little bit more of a historical and theoretical context. And this week I want to talk about some pretty heavy stuff, because we live in pretty heavy times. But this stuff is sensitive, because we're going to be talking about rape. We're going to be talking about historical atrocities. We are probably going to be talking about pedophilia. So if any of those things are not for you, now's the time to sign off. But if you do want to understand how those things bear on the politics of today, on the things that are happening in our country, then stay tuned. And to talk about them with me, I'm very excited to have on Alan Elrod. Alan, welcome to the podcast. Alan is not just but the president and CEO of the Pulaski Institution. He's also a contributing editor at Liberal Currents and has recently written a couple of essays for us on this subject. Again, welcome to the podcast, Alan.
I'm really happy to be here. Excited to do it.
All right. So I guess to start with, let's talk about that essay you wrote, Guys Win. Tell me about Guys Win.
That essay was, it kind of been something I'd been thinking about for a while, but the news story that sort of sparked, I guess, actually writing and filing it was the Tampa Bay Young Republicans extending that invitation to Andrew Tate and his brother in the wake of the Trump administration, frankly, going above and beyond to get these guys back to the United States. And for the uninitiated, Andrew Tate is a absolutely malign figure of the internet who spouts a lot of misogynistic, violent advice, mainly to young men. He basically runs. I don't know what you would call it. Like essentially like a weird sort
He's
of
an influencer,
get rich quick influencer school of masculinity on the internet. And the reality is that actually most of his audience are young men, right? Teenage boys and boys into their early 20s, and that's it. Not really anybody older than that. But he's publicly talked about abusing women, and in addition to that, there are very severe allegations against him, actually in multiple countries, by women in terms of physical abuse, and obviously the most heinous being the charges in Romania of actual trafficking. So he's got both in terms of his own words and in terms of the legal record against him, a very horrible track record of abuse and violence towards women. So I thought that was a good jumping off point. Yeah. Look, we're at a stage now where young Republicans are saying, this guy is great. Come talk to us. Right. And so it seemed like a good way to sort of explore what's happening on the right in general, that Andrew Tate is such a, not just a big figure, but someone that people are willing to embrace.
Yeah. So again, for the uninitiated in the audience, Tate is, like you say, an influencer, millions of followers on various social media apps. And he is this weird stew of like financial advice and like get rich quick schemes. But he's also like kind of what you would call a lifestyle influencer. A lot of it is like him posing with big, he's kind of jacked, right? He's posing next to some expensive car or like a raw steak or
he's a former
woman.
Kickboxing champion, so he does have like he's got physicality that is impressive, especially to a lot of young men who I think are adopting this like very sort of, I guess we'll talk about look maxing at some point, idea of male physicality.
Yeah, that's right. That it's this whole like a whole package of masculinity that he's selling to young men. And it's a masculinity of violence, especially violence towards women. It's a masculinity of rape, which he talks about and has like been accused of in very credible ways. It's a masculinity of getting rich quick without really working. Like that's a big part of it, right? It's not, he doesn't teach you how to do useful things. He teaches you like schemes and shit like that. And he's not a minor figure, right? That the Trump administration explicitly reached out and got him off in Romania, brought him to America. That, like you said, the Tampa Bay young Republicans have embraced this guy, and he's hardly the only one, right? This is a kind of mindset that, you can see a very clear parallel between Tate and the Secretary of Defense, Pete
Mhm.
Hegseth, right? Who has again been credibly accused of rape or attempted rape. Um, right, the kind of guy that like Republican female operatives wouldn't want to be alone around because he would just attack you.
Mhm.
Right, that he loves taking his shirt off and like doing workouts with the troops, right? That this kind of like image of masculinity and violent masculinity is kind of central to his whole persona. Um, and again, we can just keep on going.
Yeah.
If you get a little more esoteric, we can talk about the so-called Bronze Age pervert.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me about the Bronze Age pervert.
Bronze Age Pervert, right, is this persona built by a former Harvard student, who it's really, and I think it dovetails with Tate in a really interesting way, because the Bronze Age pervert persona is this idea that not just that men are important and that men are superior to women, but that masculinity is actually good and femininity is bad, to such an extent that actually women are, at the same time that they can be objects of like sexual desire, they're also disgusting and bad. And in fact, looking at the male body is even better than looking at the female body, because the female body is, by being feminine, necessarily worth less than the male body. So actually, Bronze Age Pervert's whole thing, and I guess the way I think it really intersects here, is this idea that um, not only are men superior to women, not only do we need to sort of recover masculine virtues, but masculine virtues also include this, frankly, kind of homoerotic idea of male physique and beauty, and that male beauty actually is also superior to female beauty. It's not just that male strength is superior to female strength, but the body of men, their physical form, is, whenever it is actually maximized, right, when it's sculpted and physically fit and muscular and all these things, is actually more beautiful than a female body. So that's actually like, I think, a really important element of this, which opens up some, I think, strange avenues of conversation about the way this stuff does and doesn't actually relate to sexual attraction, as opposed to conversations about power and disgust.
Yeah, no, I think that's all correct. And again, a little more context on the Bronze Age pervert,
Oh yeah.
right? Is that he's a relentless poster, and you can go find him on Twitter. And mostly what he posts will be like a picture of like a young muscular dude, and then like a really brief like tweet long fantasy about how that dude is on his way to like commit rape and murder. Like
Right.
that's what his output is. And he's also published a book, Bronze Age Mindset, that has become kind of what you would call a cult classic on the right. And there's actually there's a picture out there of an anonymous account on Twitter, and what they've done is they've taken the Bronze Age mindset and they're holding it up and taking a picture of it and saying we made it. And why they're saying that is what's in the background, and what's in the background is the Rose Garden, the White House, right? That this is somebody like demonstrating, like, no, but seriously, I am a staffer in the White House. I brought this book here. This is the ideology that I endorse. Um, so I think that there is what I want to talk about today is why these guys are all rapists, why they are all like their ideology is suffused with rape, why this is connected to the authoritarian turn in our country, and how it connects to pornography, actually. Like, that's the other thing about the Bronze Age pervert, especially, is like when I talk about that picture of like a young hot dude, you've talked a little bit about like looks maxing, but like there's a very pornographic aspect to the
Mhm.
kinds of fantasies and the kinds of ideologies that these people are trafficking in. Um, so that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to wind it. We'll get back here eventually to the new
Right.
right and to what the hell is going on with the new right. But I want to start by talking about history, right? And to emphasize that this connection between misogyny, between authoritarianism, and between rape isn't new exactly, but it has a lot of historical precedents. Um, and again, this is some of that heavy stuff I mentioned earlier, some of the historical atrocities. We can see the Nazis were basically obsessed with this stuff. Right, that if you read what Hitler wrote and said, how he communicated what he was trying to do, and then what they actually did, this stuff is all over it, right? That he's famous. Sorry, he's famous for the Holocaust, but that's not the only horrible thing that they got up to. So one of the lesser known projects of the Nazis was the so-called Lebensborn program. Um, and the Lebensborn program is basically like weird breeding camps for Aryan women, where like young German or German enough women would be brought in order to just be like, you're just going to be pregnant here and you're going to be pumping out babies. And then we're going to foster those children to like SS families. And also, in addition to that, it was a project of like stealing children from Eastern Europe, or at least like children who were like deemed by the state to be Aryan enough, right? Were stolen from families who were murdered and then brought to again SS families in the Reich. Um, yeah, sorry, that's a little bit heavy, and I know you've given some other examples
Mhm.
in your text about this. So it's not just the Nazis that we're talking about here. You can say, oh, they're a unique horror, but like this is kind of like a pervasive thing that runs throughout all the 20th century authoritarianisms. So I'm going to ask you, what's the phalange? Right? Unless you're a huge history nerd, you probably don't know what the phalange is. So why don't you tell us what are the phalangists? What's up with that?
Well, I think a lot of people, when they think of fascism, they think of uh, Hitler, and they probably think of Mussolini. They don't as often think of Franco's Spain. And so when you're talking about the French, you're talking about the fascist movement in Spain. But you're talking about a movement that I think is understudied. Obviously, there are many great scholars talking about Spanish fascism. But I think in the popular imagination, people think Italy, maybe, and they certainly think Germany. But the Francoist movement is really important because it does some things that neither Germany or Italy are doing. And that is that it has this deeply religious element, this very Catholic element to it. And so the fronts for Franco uh, are infused with this kind of mixture of fascist ideology, which is sort of, it's got its Spanish iterations, um, but also, right, very, very conservative Catholic ideas about family and procreation. And I don't want to mix, contemporary conservative Catholicism with what this is. But there are Catholic principles there in terms of the use of contraception, in terms of the role of women in the family, that all get applied through Francoist politics. They get channeled into the fascist movement in Spain. And what's really important to understand is that this was something that men and women both participated in. So when you look at something like the Women's Front for the women's organizations on behalf of the Phalange, you have women themselves advocating for this very submissive um, place in the home. And when I say submissive, I don't just mean they're saying you should listen to your husbands. They're saying that the purpose of a woman in the house is the pleasure of the man, sexual pleasure, feeding him, and then having children. That's it. That's the function. And that this is party advice is directly given, right? That says women should have sex with their husbands when they want, not worry about their own pleasure. Obviously, reproduction is the optimal outcome, but that's it. That's your job. And I think it's really important to understand that women are also advocating for this for other women. The way I think this is important as it sort of wins back to things we're talking about, Lebensborn and all this stuff, is that it's important to, I think, internalize that there are programmatic and there are personalist elements to how this stuff operates. So you have both institutionalized aspects of misogyny, and I think rape, we would call what was happening in Spain essentially institutionalized marital rape, because what you have is essentially a top-down party issue position that says women should essentially sexually submit at all times, and it's irrelevant what they want, when they want, and if they're pleased. That's essentially the party saying marital rape can happen at any time in this country and that it's good. So you have that, you have Lebensborn, but then you also have, in the form of the actual leaders, right, Hitler and Mussolini and all sorts of individual people, these very rapacious lifestyles and abusive attitudes towards women. And I think that's an important place where we find the intersection, right? Is you have the programs themselves, right, that treat women as stock or as some other kind of very objectified thing within the fascist framework. Franco is not as concerned with race hygiene as Hitler is, right? So the Lebensborn program is very much about like the hygienic, perfection of the Aryan race. And the Francoist project is much more infused with the idea of like Catholic virtues, right, of the household and sort of the way men and women are supposed to exist in the household and how that's supposed to like replicate society, right, in terms of the sort of patriarchal structure and things like that. So they're distinct, but the ways in which you have both the programs that are deeply misogynistic and frankly institutionalized rape, right? Lebensborn is also institutionalized rape. And then the individuals operating within those systems who themselves are constantly leaving a wake of victims behind them, I think is the place that I was, certainly where I was trying to position the essay, right, of this intersection between the programmatic ways in which fascism embeds rape into its politics, and then the personalist ways in which a lot of these people are themselves sexual criminals.
Yeah, no, I think that's important to emphasize, and Mussolini is really like the exemplar here, right? That if I understand correctly, he was a rapist before he was a fascist.
He was a
That right?
rapist before he was 20. Yeah.
Yes, right. That he, on a personal level, he, how to put this? That, like you're saying, there's this distinction. Like you might think that there's a distinction between, oh, we want to have a national policy that produces these kinds of outcomes, and that's just a different question from like my personal life and how do I want to structure my personal life and how do I relate to other people in my life and my family. But in the authoritarian programs, they're always deeply connected. Right? That Mussolini was a rapist. Mussolini was a thug. Mussolini was always obsessed with power and violence and domination. And when he comes to power in Italy, part of what he does is take these personal obsessions and like project them outwards into national policy. I don't know as much about the personal life of Francisco Franco, but certainly you can see related obsessions with Hitler. Hitler, was he a rapist? We don't really have as clear evidence for that. We do know he was a pedophile, in the sense that I believe Leni Riefenstahl was no, not Riefenstahl. What's her name? The mistress. No, sorry,
Eva
the
Braun?
wife. Yeah, Eva Braun. Thank you. Was 16, 17 when he married her. Right, that it was very specifically a very, very young woman that he chose to marry. And this, again, shows up over and over again in these kinds of authoritarian regimes. Obviously, we could also talk about the Japanese fascist project, which is functionally what they were doing. They didn't really call it that, but has very close parallels with the kinds of imperialistic projects, the kind of nationalistic projects that the European fascists were engaged in. We could talk about the Comfort Women program, which was, like you say, institutionalized rape, but this time without like the fig leaf of marriage or like Catholic procreation, but just the forcible enslavement and mass rape of foreign women, especially Korean women. And we could also talk about, if you like, the obsession with masculinity and the masculine body that pervades these fascist movements. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
I do. I mean, I think, we talked a little bit about the perfectibility aspect with someone like Bronze Age Pervert, but obviously, the male body is an obsession for Hitler. The male body is an obsession for uh, uh, Mussolini in a lot of ways. Certainly with Mussolini, there's this lineage, right, of Italian fashion really going back to Rome and sort of the Roman traditions of male physical virtues, right? With Hitler, I think it's one of those like great moments of history, right? But the Olympics happening in Germany after Hitler's in power is kind of a perfect showcasing of all of this, right? Because what you really have is just a giant opportunity to show off the physical virtues of German males, right? Which is what Hitler dreamed of. So I find this relationship between the male body as a kind of thing that's meant to be admired and aspired to, and the female body as this thing that is supposed to be dominated. Really interesting. Obviously, it's grotesque, but I actually think it's really important because people talk about this a lot now. I think in terms of rape is discussed in a much more productive way than it used to be, but a lot of people say it's not. A lot of times, it's not really about sex; it's about power. I think that is also important to understand in this context. I think that sort of misses the point when people say it because it's about both. Um, it's about sex and it's about power, but it's also about attraction and disgust. Uh, we can get into this in a little if you want, but when I brought up the Spanish case, the Wolfpack case, which is why I tied the sort of history of Spanish Francoist fascist thinking into things. Uh, they have these men who commit this gang rape in Spain. Their text art has all these things about you know expletive, really really explicit. Going to blank a fat girl, right? And so there's the sexual component, but they're clearly kind of reveling in this idea of like making it disgusting and being repellent. So like the men are all kind of hyping up each other's sexuality and virility and virtue and strength, and at the same time they were sort of like not just denigrating women as objects, but kind of wallowing in the idea of women as something that is repulsive, even as they're talking about wanting to have sex with them. And I think that you can't actually disentangle all this stuff about the male body from all of these really negative uh, this discourse about the female body. Because when it's not being talked about in the capacity of reproduction, a lot of times it's being talked about in ways that are about revulsion.
No, I think that's right, and I think this sort of shows how, like you're talking about, an aesthetics of sexual attraction or sexual disgust, a kind of a submerged homoeroticism or disgust at the female body, is tied into both a politics of authoritarianism, but also like a kind of a classic sexist worldview in which men are superior in every way and women are inferior in every way. It's this very hierarchical thinking. In ways, I mean, again, you can compare this to other kinds of patriarchal thinking, right? The classic Catholic thinking is complementarian thinking, right? Is that's the real old Catholic tradition, is that like there are male virtues and there are female virtues, and like each one is important, and like they fit together in a particular way to form like the natural human unity, and like everybody's supposed to be valued. This qualifiers there. Everybody's supposed to be a child of God. That's not really how
Yeah.
authoritarians and fascists talk about men and women.
No, well, I think that's really important to tie together because of JD Vance, right? Because you've mentioned the staffer taking the photo, but JD Vance follows Bronze Age Pervert. So like I'm far more troubled than there might be some staffer in the West Wing who reads Bronze Age Mindset. That's awful. The Vice President of the United States hasn't like follows this guy online, and JD Vance is a convert to Catholicism. But I would argue that a lot of his ways of expressing Catholicism do not line up with the much more positive. Like there is a version of these kinds of ideas that is actually very much one that arcs towards harmony, right, and people being very.
I mean, to be clear, I don't endorse complementarianism, but like it
No, I
does
don't either.
seem more like whatever if given
There
the
are
choice.
there are conservative religious ways of thinking about sex and gender that are not designed by themselves to be oppressive. Vance seems very much to want to be drawn to the ones that are. It seemed like a good place to insert JD into the conversation.
Yeah, no, JD is an interesting figure because he is really where a lot of this stuff like comes together in the administration. He's far more tapped into this kind of idea than Trump is, I think.
Mm-hmm.
He's clearly swimming in, what's sometimes called the neo-reactionary movement online. He clearly has deep connections with a lot of really radical, basically fascists and Nazis online.
Yeah.
Um, and I want to get back to how that connects to his pronatalism and related matters. But first, I want to kind of present what we've been talking about as a puzzle. And this is a puzzle that I've been thinking about for a long time. And I guess for me, it first came up when I was trying to figure out why all the TERFs are racist. And then, because they are, right? It's really, they're not subtle about it. And then also, like, why are all the racists misogynists,
Mm.
right? And why are all the authoritarians racist, misogynist, right? Why do these things all always seem to go together? Right?
Mm.
Because there's a view in which these are all just like kind of independent axes. Well, there's one kind of prejudice you might have against women, and there's another kind of prejudice you might have against this race, and a different kind of prejudice you might have against this nationality. And like authoritarianism is a political structure that you might be attracted to because like
Right.
you think monarchism is good, and like they're all kind of independent. But if they're all independent, why are they always linked in practice? Right? And as they very clearly were for the historical fascist projects we're talking about, which always had this kind of very nationalist, oftentimes exterminationist logic to them, that also had a deeply misogynist, rapist logic to them, and that also had a political authoritarian logic to them. Um, and for me, I think the answer is to understand that there's a coherent vision of the world that they're all attracted to. And it's a vision that I like to call a biopolitical vision. Um, and maybe you listeners, maybe you hear this and you think I'm talking about Foucault or various kinds of mid-century French thinkers, and that's not really who I'm referring to. There's an older tradition. The term biopolitics, I believe, was coined by Rudolf Kielen, who's I don't know, I can't remember where he's from, European thinker who wrote a book called Stormaktirna, The Great Powers. And basically, he's hardly the only one, but he puts it all together in a book and it gives it a good name. So I'm going to talk about him. He has a vision of nations not as political communities, not as a community of persons who have an interest in rights and property and community, but as biological communities first and foremost. That this is for the biopolitics thinkers, the vision of the nation as a community of biologically reproducing human beings set against other communities of biologically reproducing human beings competing for scarce resources in a zero sum world, I think that's fundamental to how they see the world. And once you put all those things together you start to get racism and sexism and misogyny out from it. Right, because you think, well, if we're going to reproductively compete with the other communities, we need to be having more children. And they'll always talk about this. This will come up all the time. Um, I have this. This is a quote. Actually, I'm gonna read it out. It's from Wilhelm Schallmayer. He was a eugenicist from like the 19th and 20th centuries. Um, it's going to sound like somebody posted it on the internet yesterday. He writes, if the flabby views and comfortable habits for which neo-Malthusians and feminists make propaganda become dominant among the white civilized nations, the white race will not only not expand over the earth, but will doubtlessly sooner or later either be militarily defeated by the tough and rapidly growing portion of the yellow race, and then be gradually replaced by its reproductively superior competition until the white race disappears, or if hostilities are avoided by all sides, the peaceful immigration of the fecund Asiatics will lead to the exact same result.
Yeah, that sounds like something off of a 4chan board. It So nationalism is my academic background. So it's always enjoyable is a relative term, but it's always interesting to me to talk about this kind of stuff. You know, you can find these echoes both in terms of other political ideologies. So Hitler's racial hygiene logic is very similar to this. That there are races, that the world is a competition between races, and that the way you win is waging war, physical war, right? Conquest, but also war through science, right? The through perfecting the racial population, right? Through experimentation and eliminating bad genes and reproducing, but reproducing in a particular way that makes it to where you don't want to keep people with disabilities. You don't want to keep people with particular what you consider to be defects, right? And that also usually for people like this includes not just like physical or mental disabilities, but just sort of disorientations, right? Being gay, being transgender, being anything else, right? So all those things. So the racial war that Hitler sees, so similar to this, right? But you also see it in subtler ways, right? From pronatalists. And the reason I always am wary when the pronatalist conversation comes up is I say, if you want to do something about declining birth rates, that's in the current moment. That's not unreasonable. We have a serious challenge. Their birth rates are declining. We've built robust, advanced economies on the backs of a certain kind of population trend. It's going to be hard to sustain some of those welfare benefits with when the population pyramid flips. Those are real conversations to be had. A person who says we should be worried about declining birth rates is not necessarily a stealth Nazi. But what happens when they also talk about their concern, right? About immigrants coming in or about other countries' birth rates being higher than ours in a way that suggests that there's going to be too many of a certain kind of person and not enough of another, which is unfortunately very commonly the second and third thing you hear out of someone's mouth when they start talking about this stuff. That is where I get very, very worried, right? And you start to say, oh, okay, this is not just about fixing a particular problem. This is actually about a concern that white people or people of a particular background are going to be quote unquote outnumbered. Or sometimes there is a concern that they will be, and this gets you into a lot of the way eugenics dovetailed with racism in the southern United States. You get a lot of concern about miscegenation, right? About the idea that it's not just that we'll be outnumbered, it's that we'll actually be bred out of existence by white people and non-white people having sex with each other and producing children, which is a supposedly terrible, terrible thing that will dilute the race. Yeah, so all of these things mix together, right? And I have my own. This is something viewers or listeners may enjoy. I've been writing about pronatalism for a while. In 2023, I went on an episode of Dr. Phil actually and talked about procreation. They had the last season of Dr. Phil. They started doing these sort of topical debates, and they did a debate on procreation. There was me. There was this researcher, wonderful Britt Ray from Stanford, who writes about the psychological impacts of climate change on millennials and Gen Z and their decisions to have kids and things like that. And then there were some people who had, as you might expect, some pretty out there ideas. One of them being this guy, Jesse Lee Peterson, who is a racist radio host out of LA. He's buddies with both Nick Fuentes and Sean Hannity and and Dennis Prager. He is black, but he did declare on that show that we needed to have more white babies, and in his own words, because black people destroy and white people create. So I think it's really important to understand. Like, this was a guy. They absolutely got him because he's controversial, but like, he is also someone like Dr. Phil didn't give this guy a platform. He had a platform already. He had a massive platform. And these ideas are out there, and they're out there in ways that you may not at all expect to encounter them until
the genius of America is that we have invented multicultural, multiracial fascism somehow. That happened.
yeah.
I don't know. It's weird. But yeah, no, I think your broader point here is important. That when I talk about biopolitics and this biopolitical view of human societies and human nations, it's kind of like how to put this. It's a structure that you can fill out in very different ways and has been filled out in very different ways, right? You can define the boundaries between us and them in all kinds of ways, right? And you can try to, maximize your reproductive fitness in various ways, right? Like the phalange has their idea where it's like, well, it's going to be all traditional Catholic values and it's going to be marital rape. But like, they don't have any of the, they're not running rape camps, right? They are not conquering other nations and stealing children, which is being done. The Germans are conquering other nations and stealing children, and the Japanese are running rape camps. And, you can try to flesh this out in various ways. But I think it's a useful way of seeing a common thread that runs through all these different ideologies and these different political projects. And I think it also connects to authoritarianism in an important way, in part because people take this fundamentally patriarchal model of the family and project it onto society, that we are going to run society as if it's a family, right? And the father, the patriarch, is going to be in charge and his word is going to be law. And this kind of connects why these leaders are the way they are and why these political structures are the way they are, that it's all united by this kind of zero-sum domination obsessed mindset that can only process relations between human beings as relations of dominance and subservience.
Daddy's back, right?
Yeah, no, and again, this is, what was that? I think it was Mel Gibson said this. That fucking guy got on TV and he said, it's like daddy's back and he's taking his belt off.
Right. Yeah. He's gonna hit us. Dad's back and he's gonna hit us. Well, I mean, the household thing is part of the reason it's compelling is because it is actually a very effective kind of quote unquote common sense way of talking about politics, right? People all the time use the household metaphor in non-malicious ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
They'll say things like, well, you got to get your, your household finances in order, or, you got to take care of the little things in the house so it doesn't fall apart. People use the household and the family as metaphor all the time for politics because it is the most intimate unit that we live in, right? Whatever your kind of family is. And even if you have like a more non-traditional kind of family unit that you kind of exist within, whatever that is, that most intimate level of relationships, that's what we're operating in on a daily basis. And so it metaphorically, we scale out a lot of times when we think about politics from that place. But you can always find that thread with the authoritarian stuff where it's like, yeah, but in this version, right, dad gets to hit us and being hit is good and being dominated is good and being submissive is good.
Yeah. So I think I want to pick up on that line, being dominated is good and being submissive is good, because there's the family metaphor, but these days there's a lot of porn metaphors.
Yeah, let's talk about porn.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm sorry, again, content
Yeah.
warnings, but we have to
Good.
talk about porn because it is just all over how these people think and act.
Yeah.
Um, and you can kind of, so there's one, I think you quote it in this guy's Win article. JD Vance goes on a podcast with one of these far right, quote,
Yeah.
luminaries. And this guy has also written a blog post in which he says that his offer to feminists is rape, that he offers feminists rape as an olive branch.
Right.
And what he's talking about, what he's trying to suggest here is like, well, there's this world we live in where, like, this is their worldview, right? Is that men have forgotten how to be men and women have forgotten how to be women, and men are emasculated and women are masculinized. And what we need is rape. And rape will like reset the natural order. And afterwards, people will be happy about it, right?
Mhm.
Men will be happy to be men and women will be happy to be women, right? And you can just see that, again, I don't want to get too far into the details here, but like this is all over certain kinds of pornography, right? It is a porn storyline about dominance and submission. And that's, to me, I think that is part of what they're selling to young men, right? And we bring it back to Tate, to his aspects as a lifestyle influencer of like an image and a story that he's selling to young men is part of what makes it attractive is a certain degree of sexual excitement, a certain
Mhm.
degree, a certain pornographic gloss on a political program.
Yeah, so I think that talking about porn allows us to talk about a few of the different things we've been building up to. One is this relationship between excitement and disgust. And I think that you can actually see this on the right from both the secular new right and the religious new far right. So on the religious side, there's a lot of porn is evil, porn is bad, porn is destructive, right? But then we find out that a lot of these people are
Porn
like porn
maniacs.
and also like not even just like legal, but like also abhorrent, right? Even some of them even consume a lot of, frankly, we've had numerous people outed, right, in the past few months, for the religious right in terms of child pornography and
Yes.
things that are
Not child pornography, but also just pedophilia, right?
right.
Like actual, no, but seriously, they had sex with a child pedophilia.
Right.
And we'll come back to that. I do want to
Yeah.
come back to that because it's a
And on the
key thing
secular
here.
right, I think it's more about self control. It's about this idea of porn is porn is actually effeminizing you, which is I don't even really know how, but like porn is making you weak and effeminate. And so you're supposed to be a man who's excited by sex with women, but you're also supposed to reject pornography as beneath you, right? That's a little bit more of like the secular argument. The religious one tends to have more to do with the kind of moral repulsion, whether they actually feel that or not, but it's the language they choose. And the secular side is a little more around the idea of like porn is a weakness, right? Real men don't need porn because real men go out and take what they want from the world. And that includes sex with women, right? And the implicit idea is like you go and you get sex, right? Whether they want it or not.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think there's that aspect of it, but I think this is also maybe a place to talk about trad wives.
Oh yeah.
Right? The trad wife is like kind of like a style of influencer where it's always a woman and she gets herself dolled up to the max in like a kind of a 50s aesthetic
Mm-hmm.
or a cottagecore aesthetic or a kind of pastoral aesthetic, but an extremely sexualized one, right? Usually
Oh
she'll
yeah.
be like popping out of her dress in some ways, and then she'll like do, weird household tasks like, making cookies or doing the dishes
Sweeping
or
or yeah. It's very
carrying
weird.
eggs around. The egg video
The
is
egg
unnerving.
raw produce is always the weirdest part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is so the whole trad wife influencer thing is interesting to me because, I mean, it's basically just softcore porn, but you don't
Mm-hmm.
admit that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I think, kind of gets to what you've been talking about, a way these people have this strange relationship with porn where their politics are very pornographic, even as they themselves are like, no, 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 we shouldn't consume porn because it's disgusting or it's effeminizing. So you have these substitutes, right, that are like this weird blend of both political content, right? The trad wife influencers are selling a vision of a patriarchal society and a patriarchal organization, but they're also kind of selling sex.
But it also makes the trad wife thing popped in my head at the very beginning or very early part of this conversation when we were talking about women in Francoist Spain and the advocates for women saying essentially, no, this is good, this is your place, right? It's really important, I think, to understand that there is also an apparatus of women actually
Yes.
helping to build and sustain this stuff.
Yes. No, I mean, as Catherine McKinnon would have put it, it's the eroticization of female submission. And some women, clearly the tradwives, get something out of that, or they pretend to anyways, right? It is not, the story they're selling is not purely an ugly story, right? There's a kind of an unpleasant, whatever. I would suggest kind of an unpleasant, but like a fantasy of submission, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the core story, is that everybody's happy afterwards. In practice, it never really works like that, right? People don't like being trapped in the house, in the kitchen, having children all the time. Like, no one actually likes that very much. But you can tell a
Yeah.
story about it. And yeah, I do want to talk a little bit about pedophilia.
Okay.
Um, and again, if you follow this stuff at all, you'll have heard this phrase pedocon theory,
Right.
um, which is basically the suggestion that pedophilia is very common among conservatives and conservative politicians. And again, this is one of the things I mean, it's so uncomfortable to talk about that more people don't know about it. Like there's so much of the things we've been talking about here today are what you might call self-censoring facts that people find so uncomfortable to talk about that they just don't even want to recognize them. But like Republican politicians have repeatedly gotten busted for grooming children. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the grooming thing is important, right? Because what they are trying to do is make these pornographic fantasies real. And that's harder to do when you're confronting an adult human being who like has a certain level of like emotional maturity and autonomy, but children are children, and
Mm-hmm.
it's easier to mess with their heads. It's easier to groom children. And that's what they're doing, right? They are trying to groom children to participate in these kinds of sexual fantasies of dominance and submission.
You know, the kind of top line for me on a lot of this stuff is if you're just constantly talking and writing about sex, uh, in the way that some of these people are, I don't mean in the way that like a scholar of sex does, but like in this kind of like never ending, always at full tilt hysteria about sex. My tendency is to assume that really must dominate your life in a way that it doesn't dominate mine. Um, and so, you know, when people say pedocon theory, I'm like, well, this is where this particular approach to politics has become very popular. Is this kind of obsession, right, with who's having sex, with when they're having sex, how they're having sex, whether or not someone else is having sex the way you think they should be having sex, what other someone else's thoughts on sex align with your thoughts on sex, which is again, a set of preoccupations that I just don't share, and I think that tend to be indicative of a disordered level of obsession about different people's sexual predilections and habits. Uh, and is usually to me this kind of first warning sign that someone is potentially got a frankly disordered relationship to sex in general.
Like you say, being obsessed with sex, and you dress it up in this moralistic language about how it's awful and you're against it and you hate pedophilia and you're trying to stop sex trafficking, and you make a whole movie about how you're a hero
Sound of
fighting against sex trafficking. And it comes out that the makers of Sound of Freedom, again, this movie about sex, theoretically a movie about them fighting the plague of sex trafficking, that these guys are sexually assaulting women and they are sexually assaulting children. Right.
Right. And Josh Duggar, the Duggars, famous in Arkansas, Josh Duggar's arrest over child pornography. This all comes back though, I think, to me, the thing this is why I really think it's helpful to think in this kind of dynamic of attraction and repulsion, because you can't separate it. This kind of like they're disgusted, but they're transfixed, and yet they're repulsed, and yet they can't. They're obsessed, right? And so those two things that are constantly happening at the same time, where it's like it's this fixation, but there's this constant subtext of of disgust and uh, 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 you know, revulsion and rejection, and I mean, again, it's a deeply disordered way to talk about this stuff, and I think that's also really important to say over and over again, right? Because what they're trying to do is say that our view is the natural proper order, and it is, I think, actually really important to say it is deeply disordered and and deeply uh, unhealthy. I mean, I think that should be obvious, but that has to constantly, I think, be reasserted, because what they're the thing that makes it frightening is this constant insistence that their view, this deeply warped view, is actually this received, simple, obvious order from nature.
No, I think that's very interesting because, like you say, they're always obsessed. They're very insistent that this is all natural and this is all normal, and yet at the very same time, they are going through enormous lengths to make it happen, to like chop the world into conformity to what they think it ought to look like, what this patriarchal order ought to look like. And you can see it in the exaggerated performances of masculinity and femininity among the right wing. Generally, a concept that I called reactionary camp in a
Mm.
recent essay for Liberal Currents.
I love
Um,
this idea. This is a really wonderful idea.
yeah, and you can just see, I mean, to be blunt, the way a lot of these figures on the right, they're all on steroids. They're all on steroids. Like, how do you look like that when you're 50 years old? Is steroids, right? That's the short answer, right? How do you get to be that large without just being a professional bodybuilder who does nothing but bodybuild? Is steroids. And similarly, I mean, Republican women go through enormous lengths to look a certain way, right? I mean, just the plastic surgery face, right? The dyed hair, the pancake makeup, the plastic surgery on the face, but also the rest of their body, right? To create this idealized, almost like too far, like beyond the point of like that looks good to like you're like an over exaggerated campy portrayal of what you think a properly feminine woman ought to look like.
Yeah.
um
And we're seeing this trickle down into society more generally, right? We have a serious problem with young boys taking steroids and trying to achieve looks that are not physically really possible for their age, and that the things that they are doing to try to get to that point are deeply dangerous for their bodies, especially at a point where they're going through a lot of changes in development. I mean, really, it's a serious. We talk a lot about the internet's effect on young women in terms of body dysmorphia. It is having a devastating effect on young men.
yes, no, I think that's true, and it's again something that people kind of like don't want to talk about, that it is feel a little uncomfortable, but like yes, young men are under an immense amount of body pressure and they are not reacting to it in a healthy way. In many cases, whatever, maybe a young man and he's fine, but like a lot of them are clearly consumed by a feeling of inadequacy, right? That they have to match these hyper masculine, hyper idealized images that are pumped into them from their phones. And there's lots of people who will say, well, I've got a pill, I've got a shot, I've got a surgery, I've got a whatever, that I've got a diet. Anorexia is a real problem, right? That'll put you on the path to being the perfect man, right? And I think this gets to what you've been talking about, is this disordered aspect to it, this insistent that this is natural, but also this tremendous anxiety that it isn't, and how this is just driving a lot of really disordered behavior, a lot of disordered sexual behavior on the right that underlies so much of their politics. So, we're getting on towards the end of our conversation here. It's been totally cheery and
Yeah,
happy.
yeah.
So, I thought I'd ask you a question. The question I like to ask towards the end of our conversations: what do you think we should do about this? Right? How do we respond? How do we react? What is a better future we can get to from where we are?
Well, you know what? This actually, especially the stuff we're talking about with young men, this really dovetails with the kind of preoccupations I have in general along sort of Robert Putnam's lines of civic disorder and engagement. Man, form relationships in your community. I mean, if you're a parent, reach out to those kids in your life, the young men in your life, especially. But if you have the opportunity to like do something with like Big Brother, Big Sister, to sponsor a youth sports league, these are, I mean, this seems silly, but you have to present alternative models. Andrew Tate is effective because Andrew Tate is in your. I'm just going to say this right now because it sounds scary, but also because it's probably true. If you have a young man in your life, he's in their phone and in their head right now, giving them a version of what life is supposed to be like. And if you don't give them an alternative, that's what they have. If you don't give them people saying there are other ways to be virtuous, to be successful, to be masculine, frankly. If people want to feel masculine, that's not bad, but you have to give them a way to feel that and be that isn't this deeply horrifying, disordered thing. And you can only really create that by going out into the world and creating places where people can actually find those supports, whether it's sports leagues or book clubs. I mean, men can join book clubs, right? It doesn't have to all be like sports and athleticism. I mean, that's fun, but
Yeah.
there are other things. Yeah. But
Tabletop role playing. Sorry.
100%. I love D&D and I run games for friends. Do this though. Create these places where there are intergenerational conversations happening. And especially because of the conversation we're having today, intergenerational conversations between men, where young men see there are ways to be in the world as a man who is confident and kind and also kind to themselves, who because they're not going to be kind to the world if they can't do that first. They're really not.
No, I think that's exactly right. This is something I wrote about recently for Liberal Currents, and as I say, called the new gender synthesis. But that we do have to
It's a
give.
really good essay. I'll say that right now. Everybody should go read
I endorse this message. You should
it.
go. You should definitely go read that essay. But that we have to give people a model, like you said, where they can be strong but also kind, right? Where they can embrace masculine virtues but also embrace feminine virtues, right? To be a complete human being and not the parody of humanity that Tate and others are trying to sell, right? A parody that's based on fear and loneliness
Mhm.
fundamentally, and that rejects human connection, right? So I mean, it sucks to be lonely. It sucks to be young and to be lonely, but you can connect with people. You can find activities to connect with people that are not just posting on the internet. And what that might be, right, that depends on you. Right. For me, it's role playing games, right? Like I know this sounds goofy, but like I recognize we live in an atomized society. It can be hard to connect with people. Like a
Sure.
good long running tabletop role playing campaign can keep you in touch with people for years,
Hmm.
right? Meeting your friends weekly, week after week after week. It's like a real point of human contact that can be hard to find in this world. Um, but everybody has something different.
This will also maybe sound strange, like, but even for the things you want to do that are a little more alone, like reading a book, consider going and doing it in a public space. I know that sounds odd, but like physically being around other people has an effect on us. Uh, you can go read down at the local library or a quiet bar, and being out in the world is still really good for you. I just think that it's so important to be out around people, even sometimes just around other people doing their own thing. That's a thing. That is a real way to go out and be in the world, but it's so critical.
Yes. No, I think that's quite right. There's a way in which everything we've been talking about is so tied up with phones. I mean, and social
Yeah.
media and the ability of social media to deliver straight to your eyeballs these idealized, perfect images over and over, right?
Mhm.
An idealized world that is just like created via steroids and Instagram filters. And if that is like calibrating your internal brain sense of like what men and women have to be, that is a disorder, frankly.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, I think fundamentally, if we want to combat the kinds of narratives, the kinds of sexual, misogynistic, rapist narratives that the new right is selling, we have to offer young people, especially young men, a better vision, a vision of a complete human life.
Well, so I know you just did a beautiful kind of thing that could end, but
No, go ahead,
maybe
go ahead.
is I think about this on transgender issues too, because for trans men who want to become men or want to embody their manliness, right, in that way, you got to actually offer them a roadmap for what it means in that transition, and a place for them that says masculinity is actually this wonderfully diverse thing that can accommodate so many different types of people and personalities and interests and is good, right? Because I don't really want people in that experience as well to think like, well, the only path to manhood in this transition is this very specific fixed thing that really may not even be like uh, attainable.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my personal experience, trans men tend to have a better idea about masculinity. That for
I've thought
them,
about it
it's not.
harder than all. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that
yeah.
they've thought about it for a long time, and that for them, they don't see it as a prison, but something worth choosing.
Mhm.
Right, and I think for a lot of men, masculinity is functionally a prison, but it doesn't have to be. Right, there are ways out of it, and like you can look to trans dudes and what they're trying to do with masculinity to see a freer future.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a great way to put it.
yeah. So anyway, so much more to talk about here. Could talk about trans issues for far too long.
Yeah.
But yes, Alan, thank you so much for coming on Neoliberalism. This has been a great conversation. Um, and I'm sure I'll see you around.
Yeah.
Uh,
Happy to do it.
yeah. To everybody in the audience, thanks again for tuning in. I'm sorry there was no episode last week. As you may have noticed, I'm still coughing a little bit. I was quite under the weather last week, but hopefully we're back to our regular schedule. As a reminder, Liberal Currents is a listener-supported publication. So if you want to support what we're doing, or to just be in touch with the community that we have on Discord, or the essays that we publish on Liberal Currents, just head on over to liberalcurrents.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you all next week.